Becker, and I'm the Dean of Educational and Cultural Resources at Sul Ross State University. I want to welcome everyone to the second lecture in the series, the Sul Ross Spotlight. This is an online monthly lecture series open to the public that will highlight the expertise and research of Sul Ross State University folks. The Sul Ross Spotlight is sponsored by the PAC First, the Professional Development Initiative from the Educational and Cultural Resources Division. The mission of this division is to connect our resources with our campus and community and to make the most of our special offerings to enhance the quality of life on campus and throughout our communities. Today, we're spotlighting Sid Balman Jr., Sul Ross's writer-in-residence, novelist, national security correspondent, and behavior change communication specialist. At some point in our lives, we may find ourselves somewhere on the radicalization spectrum, disrespected, disenfranchised, abused, or a victim of perceived injustice. But very rarely do we turn to acts of violence or terrorism. What is it that pushes someone over the edge to join a violent extremist organization, attack the US Capitol, or hijack an airplane and fly it into the World Trade Center? Sid Balman has spent a lifetime studying these issues, from the front lines of wars to the dark underbelly of the internet chat rooms, during 3 decades as a reporter and behavior change communication specialist. His trilogy of novels, Seventh Flag, Murmuration, and the upcoming Sisterhood, much of which takes place in West Texas, are works of historical fiction that focus on these themes. Today's talk will highlight Sid's research, writing, and experience. So before we get started, I wanted to do just a little bit of housekeeping. So if you're having issues, we have staff members standing by for tech assistance on Microsoft Teams chat. Your mics and your cameras are muted today so that we can all hear and see the presentation without distractions. We'll unmute the cameras during the question and answer session. Today's lecture will be about 40 minutes with time at the end for questions. So please enter your questions into the Microsoft Teams chat, and at the end of Sid's lecture, I'll read the chat questions to be answered. So without further delay, hello Sid, thanks so much for being our Sul Ross Spotlight guest this month. We've all been waiting to hear from you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, April. Thank all of y'all for joining. Please let April know if I'm not speaking loud enough or if there are any technical difficulties. I see a few old friends in there. Thank you for coming. Tom, Barton, etc. I'm not here to talk about myself, but I do want to give a little background. As April said, I am the writer-in-residence here at Sul Ross, and they have my Sul Ross State University. My great thanks for letting me have that position. I've been here about a year. And in addition to writing, my other job, I teach journalism and creative writing, and I advise the student newspaper, The Skyline, and I would urge all of you to follow it on your social media. It's very feisty, West Texas voice. So most of my career has been in journalism. I started with the old Dallas Times-Herald after graduate school, covering cops and robbers, actually one of the more interesting, maybe the most interesting beat I've ever had. Worked my way up the ladder, journalism ladder, with a series of jobs, and ended up based out of Washington, D.C., where I was based the last 25 years or so. And I worked for United Press International, at the time one of the largest news organizations in the world. I got that job by sheer luck at a very young age as a result of a friendship I struck up during the first Gulf War. My job was to cover diplomacy and national security. That was my beat. And just a couple of, did we get the next slide there, April? Good, okay. So just to give you a little taste of what I did. So there were 2 parts to that job. One was to cover the wars, to lead our coverage of the wars during that period, the 90s into the 2000s. I mean, as you can see on the bottom left there, I'm holding holding a rifle with no clip in it. Those of you who are gun people will see that immediately, so you got me. I'm in Serb-occupied Bosnia-Herzegovina, during the Balkan Wars. That's a Balkan nation. Top right, overlooking Mogadishu in Somalia, where I covered the failed American international humanitarian intervention. And there were all the wars of that time and the big stories. Also, the second part of that job was to travel on the airplanes with the American presidents, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Bill Clinton, and to travel with the secretaries of state, Jim Baker, a Texan, Warren Christopher, top left there. You can see I'm sitting with a fellow journalist, and there's Warren Christopher, who would come onto the back of the plane and chat with us, always off the record, of course. And on the bottom right there, I'm meeting the King Hussein of Jordan, the late King Hussein of Jordan, and I'm in Amman preparing for an interview with him. So as the internet began to emerge, I could see very quickly that content, news would become content, and the whole world would change. So I left daily journalism. I'm still a working journalist, among other publications I write for, or Outside Magazine. And I got more into the communication side of things. Started a small company, and which was absorbed by another. But the expertise that I developed was in what they call behavior change communications. And that is exactly what it sounds like, where through various techniques, some scientific, some not, a lot of it based in the tools that are provided by the internet, you can put together campaigns, if you will, to change people's behavior, whether it's drunk driving or gun control, or we did our share of political campaigns. My particular interest, given my background, was in the area of counterterrorism and violent radicalism. That's what I'm here to talk to you all about primarily. And I don't want to be too nerdy about it, but I will nerd out a little bit. And my last corporate job, which wasn't too long ago, was with a company that wanted to develop a specialization in that. Most of the work being done on behalf of governments and government agencies in the United States and Europe and elsewhere. I think you can imagine which agencies would be most focused on that. That's where I really had very interesting and also very trying experiences. Most of the work that I did in that period was under the Obama administration, at least the work we did for the United States and various national security agencies, to a large degree in other countries where the United States had a strategic interest. West Africa, we did a fair amount of work with violent gangs in Latin America, Honduras. We had a program in San Pedro Azul, which at the time was a hotbed of gang activity, the highest murder rate in the world. There were certain, as we became better and better at it, we were able to develop certain common denominators that, if you will, of radicalization and ways to attempt to mitigate them. So that's me, and I'm going to just now sort of go into this part. Oh, I forgot one other very important thing. I'm also a novelist. Put in a plug here for my two, as April mentioned, and I'll get to how I got into this area. A lot of these novels, it's a trilogy. It's called the Seventh Flag Trilogy. Much of it takes place in West Texas, as April mentioned, but it goes all over the world. They focus on two families out of the small town of Del City, about 80 miles east of El Paso. Those of you who know it, the area may have gone through there. If you blink, you might have missed it. Great people, very, very small town. The books are historical fiction, but in large part, they're based on two families there. One is a prosperous farming family. The other is a family of Syrian Muslim immigrants that helps them build this empire on the high desert. The second novel just came out about 2 months ago, Murmuration, and the third novel, The Sisterhood, is due for publication in 2023. And they're really about two things at their core. One is the radicalization of America, and to a lesser degree the West, Europe, if you will, and Europe as it now exists, and about what it means to be an American. And it focuses on the migration experience and how that sort of goes through the sieve of the American experience. So let's get on to the main part here. You know, it's hard to imagine two more different people than these two you're looking at here. On the right is Brendan Tarrant. You may have been familiar 2 years ago. He's an Australian citizen, and he shot up a couple of mosques in New Zealand. And classic case of radicalization. On the left is a young woman from Alabama, Hoda Muthana. She's American-born Yemeni, and at the time, a couple of years ago, and her case has not been resolved, she was seeking repatriation into the United States after going off to Syria, joining ISIS, and bearing a child. And you know, they have a lot in common. There are certain characteristics they have in common with others. You may recognize some of these groups that are clearly on the radicalization spectrum. The Black Lives Matter group, and I'm not being judgmental here at all, I'm just sort of being scientific in a way. There are elements of justified, which I think they are, or not. You may not think so. They are to a degree, many of them radicalized. Of course, they're not violent. They haven't been overtly violent like some of these other groups. And of course, the event that triggered that was the murder of George Floyd. In the bottom left there, you see Derek Chauvin, who was convicted of that murder. Clearly a radicalized person, radicalized to the point of kneeling on a man's neck long enough to kill him. In the middle is Stephen Paddock. Probably don't recognize him or recognize his name, but he's the man who's climbed up to the 18th floor of the Mandalay Hotel and opened fire on a concert in Las Vegas. And on the right, of course, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11. You know, some of them were able to look into why they became radicalized. It's obvious in some cases. In the case of Stephen Paddock, we'll never know, and they've never been able to know. And of course, this picture, which I think probably everybody recognizes, the siege at the Capitol on January 6th. Here, those of you in Alpine might have had a neighbor or two who participated in that. Clearly radicalized to the point of attacking the U.S. Capitol to try and stop the results of the election being certified, presidential election. And I think as I get deeper into my talk, you'll see why. But let's just go back to these two, Brandon Tarrant and Hoda Muthana. So what do they? You know, when you peel back, you know, you say so they can't possibly have anything in common. But you know, you peel back the surface of you know, their different personal narratives. You find that their path towards radicalization, that twisted path, is well worn and classic. I mean, it's kind of ironic that, you know, the violent right-wing extremist and his Muslim mirror image, although we don't know a lot about her, but she was radicalized enough to go off to join ISIS in Syria. It's ironic that they share really anything, and they would probably both object greatly to it. But when it comes to countering, this phenomenon of violent radicalization and dealing with those who've answered its siren call, it would be a fool's errand not to accept the viewpoint that there is a common denominator. And that common denominator is what gave companies like the one I worked for several years a way to build effective prevention and rehabilitation programs. I did, at one point, we did a project for the government of Kosovo. Kosovo is one of the Balkan republics, the former Yugoslavia, which splintered violently after the fall of the Soviet Union. And what they had a problem also with returning fighters. It's a largely Muslim, almost predominantly Muslim country, although whether it's a country or not is still in dispute a bit. And I don't mean to offend any of my Kosovar Muslim friends. I think they would agree. But very interesting, one of the places we visited was the maximum security prison in the capital, outside the capital, Pristina, gleaming new prison, and interviewed the warden there, Rasim Selmani. He was very generous and gracious with his time. And he had a special sort of kind of a laboratory for radicalism, because the law there required that returning fighters had to spend a couple years in prison. Many of them took it as a badge of honor. And so he had this kind of laboratory to work with radicalized people and what to do. And his, a lot of the work that I did was with this included was with a security clearance. So some of this I can't go too far into, but I'll go as far as I can. One of his main problems there was, and it's the same in American prisons too, if you look deep enough. What do you do with these people that are these radicalized, profoundly radicalized people who have engaged in heinous acts of violence for whatever reason, whether it's a religious calling or a national calling? Do you put them in the general population and give them the opportunity to radicalize others, as a number of groups do in American prisons? Or do you segregate them to themselves, as we do in Guantanamo Bay, for example, and just allow them to seethe and become further radicalized? He had a very progressive view, and one that I agree with, that it is a public health problem. That's an approach that the Obama administration and their allies in Europe agreed with. And when you look at it in that way, whether it's COVID, for example, or drunk driving, or abuse of one's spouse, you find that there are, it's a public health problem. There are primary, secondary, and tertiary symptoms, and they should be treated with primary, secondary, and tertiary measures, like any disease. And I view it as a disease. If you look at the example of a tree, for example, trees are very interesting ecosystems. And I'm not a botanist or anything, but I read a very interesting book, which I would recommend, called The Overstory, which looks very deeply into trees and how they interact and so forth. But if you have a sick tree that can get the trees around it sick, you're not going to go up and expect to heal that tree by snipping off a few leaves. You've got to go into the roots where the problems begin, and figure out what's wrong. So it all starts with diagnosing, in my view, the community like a grove of trees. The resiliency of that community, and identifying factors that might contribute to unrest among community members. which could eventually trigger certain types of individuals to act out violently. I suppose we all have some penchant for violence within us, but what is it that makes us cross that rubric to actually act out? For example, an economically strapped neighborhood might express frustration with the lack of funding for youth sports programs compared to more prosperous areas of a city. But if you dig below the surface a little bit, and there's lots of tools, some we were given by certain government agencies, some are open source tools, such as opinion research techniques, social media sentiment analysis, heat mapping, and so forth. You may find lurking there the seeds of larger problems that stem generally from feelings of disenfranchisement, disrespect, injustice, and discrimination. Sometimes there's abusive family elements there. And addressing these underlying problems with solutions, you need to address these underlying problems with solutions that respond to these symptoms. And that really is the key to community health and mitigating violent extremism. So those factors can really be a toxic stimulant for individuals for vulnerable individuals. And there's a certain profile we developed of people who, well, I would say, first of all, I should have said this at the top. I'm no expert. There's no such thing as experts in this area. It's a constantly evolving set of understandings and techniques that I don't know that, given the track record of what's gone on, that it's getting any better, and they take time and patience, which few governments have. And you will never, ever find the lone wolf. The Las Vegas shooter, for example. That's not the point of these programs. The point is to empower communities to be able to manage and sense these trends. But there is a profile of people who tend to turn towards the violent side. They're generally loners. They might have been bullied or suffered from some form of physical or emotional handicap. They spend a lot of time on the web, playing violent shooter survivor games, surfing porn sites, and interacting with strangers in the dark corners of these hidden chat rooms. Much like, they're prey to these. There's predators out there for extremists, just like there are for pedophiles or whatever, and they're experts. And as a parent, I worried a lot about what like those of you who are parents, what are my kids doing in their room with the door closed on the internet 3 or 4 hours at a chunk? I asked, and given what I was doing at the time, was interested and paid attention to it. But they're sitting ducks. I mean, in the area of extremism, whether it's your child or Yemeni American woman, 17-year-old Yemeni American woman, they are sitting ducks for extremist recruiters. And these people are expert predators, and they prey on them with tried and true brainwashing techniques. And they procure them over time very, very successfully. And there's many chapters, and there's a couple of characters in my books that go through this process. And if you're interested, and it's told in a lively fictional way based on fact, I would refer you to it. Whether it's violence or just leaving your family in Alabama and going to war-torn Syria. So a lot of the work we did was overseas, as I said. Mali, Yemen, Turkey, Honduras, so on. The Obama administration leaned towards what we were doing and funded these programs. But the ISIS and Al Qaeda type. But as we got deeper into it, ISIS and Al Qaeda were doing a lot of recruiting out of the United States. And the Obama administration was interested in why. And there was a particular spike of it in Minnesota. Minnesota, and this is a big part of my second book. Minnesota has the largest Somali population in the country, hundreds of thousands. I knew the Somalis from the time I spent in Somalia covering the war there. And I also had some exposure to them. I have made a lot of friends at all levels of Somali society. And there was one particular case that the FBI, and we were brought in after this, that the FBI uncovered where I think it was about 12 Somalis, both young men and women, who were recruited by ISIS and their East African affiliate, Al-Shabaab, to go fight in Syria. The FBI penetrated that group and caught a fair number of them, about, say, over half a dozen. Some of them are still in prison, some of them are not. Many of them left. And so the Department of Homeland Security wanted to take a look at why that happened, take a look at the Somali community in Minneapolis. And we put together a program there and validating a lot of what we had found. But what was most, I suppose, interesting and troubling was that among the adjacent communities, particularly the white community, and also among law enforcement, we were seeing some of the same characteristics of radicalism. Of course, I don't need to explain to you what happened in Minneapolis in subsequent years. And we took a look at other communities in this country, and this was kind of between as the Tea Party movement had emerged just prior to the election of Donald Trump. And these radicalized trends we were seeing throughout the country. What we were seeing in Yemen, we were also seeing in American cities. And I think that any fair-minded look at where this country is now will see that has gone well along the road of radicalization. So working with these at-risk communities, barring the slim chance of an informant or finding the needle in the haystack of the World Wide Web, it's a long-term proposition. And as I said, governments are not patient. You'll never find the lone wolf, and the next mass shooting, whether it's in Sarasota at the Pulse nightclub, the Bataclan Theater in Paris, or the Al Noor Mosque in Christchurch, it just gives fuel to opponents of these types of programs. And Congress doesn't have a lot of patience either. But let's go back and sort of apply what I've been saying to Brendan Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter. As I said, we don't know much about the Yemeni woman, but so Tarrant, before he went on his shooting spree, killed a lot of people, a lot of Muslims. He wrote a 74-page manifesto, and of course, there's accounts of his acquaintances. It reveals a classic case of really a fully radicalized individual. He was a class clown growing up. He was a loner. He was a poor student. His teachers said he barely achieved passing grades. As an adult, he cashed in on cryptocurrency. He roamed the world for a couple years. He was obsessed, and this is quoting him, with white genocide at the hand of, another quote from him, quote, Islamic slavers. Even though he was Australian, he saw President Trump as a, quote, and this is quoting from his manifesto, a quote, symbol of renewed white identity. He admired perpetrators of a mass shooting in Norway, and of course in South Carolina, of the Black Baptist Church. And interesting enough, he was obsessed with two online games, Fortnite, a violent shooter game, and Spyro the Dragon. So if your kids are playing Spyro the Dragon, you may want to ask him about it. And he was even deluded into saying he was once a U.S. Navy SEAL with 300 confirmed kills, all of which was BS. So they're both, they're both incarcerated now. And again, prison authorities are caught on the horns of a dilemma whether to segregate them or let them into the population. As I said, the Obama administration supported this. With the election of President Trump, everything changed, and they did not have the patience or the energy or the philosophical commitment to the public health approach to these issues, and they basically cut funding. And what funding they didn't cut involved the kind of activities that I didn't care to be involved with. And so that was when I decided it was time to start writing novels. And so all that string I collected over all those years pulled out of my back pocket and decided to write novels, and which led to, and this is just going a couple years back, led to my my job here at Sul Ross University. But so a little lighter here. No one is born radicalized. I think, this is an idealized picture, but I think, that's kind of the way we all are, with a few exceptions. Sweet young girl with bunnies, empathetic, sympathetic, and kind. And I don't want to get, overly nerdy, as I said, but I want to take you through a tool we developed that helped to, we use to diagnose these communities. This was, a deck from a slide we used, diagnosing instability and building resilience, which is really what you need to do. And you don't do that by bringing in a bunch of experts into a community. You do that by training the trainer, by empowering nonprofits, by working with city governments, working with police force, working with the mayors, working with city council, working with community groups, with sports groups, in some cases with church groups. For example, in Honduras, we found that the Catholic Church was a great partner in working to mitigate gang recruitment. In this one tool we developed, it was a mapping tool designed to help assess the overall health of governance systems, identifying specific weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and developing tailored, targeted approaches to enhance community resilience. What it did, you want to make this as analytical as possible, as accurate, as much as data-driven as possible. Excuse me. So it provided a standardized lens to analyze governance system, and a lot of it begins with frustration with governance, systematically evaluating the processes and outcomes in 8 functional dimensions and 7 factors of stability. It's a qualitative assessment, questionnaire basically, with some social media analysis involved on government systems, everything from service delivery to civic participation and more. And these can be used it doesn't take a lot of time. You can gather data quickly. You can get you can move quickly to bolster and put programs in place that have to continue over time. They are also interesting tools for politicians to look at, how they can improve their performance for elections. That's not something we did, but invariably, I'm sure it was used for that. So, as I said, there's 7 factors that that display fragility and resiliency. 8 dimensions of local governance. So the areas, and you can even sort of apply these to your family. If you have a large bunch of kids, certainly you can apply it to your community. And if you are feeling, as many of us do, frustrated, ask yourself, take a look at this and ask yourself why, and you may see. So the key factors that can be fragile and can break and can lead to radicalizations, are people, is it an inclusive community? Are people involved in decisions? Is authority decentralized, or is it a dictator at the top? Dictator at the top all the way down the spectrum. Is society, is there social cohesion? Is it a closed society, or is it splintered? How does government perform? Do they pick up your trash in your neighborhood? Or do they ignore your neighborhood and pick up trash in another neighborhood? Is your local football field as good as it should be? Civic infrastructure. Are you provided with the things you need, water, sanitation, etc.? Do you trust your leaders? And are they viewed as legitimate? Legitimacy is really important because that gets at the heart of a democracy and at elections. And we're seeing exactly right now what happens when people who are trusted by almost half the population don't think an election is legitimate. And again, that's that is a trigger of radicalism and just takes root. And the kind of the underlying factors would be, the quality of leadership, how effective the administration of your community is or your country. Is it corrupt? Does it have good fiscal management? Do certain groups of people get breaks financially that others don't? Are services delivered in a effective and regular way? Again, civic participation. What about the security environment? Police? How do the police interact with people? I mean, that's an area that's come under great scrutiny, as it always should. And that leads to justice and the fair application of rule of law, and of course the economic foundations of a community. So I will stop there, and I've covered a lot of territory. I'm happy to answer questions about it.
Hey, Sid, we have one question right now for you. This question is from Tom Barton, and Tom wants to know, how much do state actors contribute to radicalization in the U.S.?
Well, I don't want to go too political here. And I suppose, Tom, that you mean by state actors are some of our elected officials. And this is just my view. I think that they are the match that lights the tinder. I would never, I'm not that old, but I would never have expected, and I'm not the first to say this, to have seen what happened on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. And I don't think that any nation in the world, any leaders in the world expected to see that. And I think it is a very troubling signal to both allies and foes alike. I think it highlights the power of our elected officials and the importance of electing responsible, experienced people. And what I have found, and I don't say this, as an America First guy or America's greatest country in the world or anything, although I'm an American and a loyal American. But the other leaders, America is sort of the leading, or it has been sort of the leading edge. And when you, with the election of Donald Trump, you saw the emergence of a number of similar of leaders who had similar styles. Duterte in the Philippines, Orban in Hungary, all following the same playbook with the same BS about fake news and so on and so forth. And I just take a second the simple answer is yes, Tom. But just take a second to digress for a moment on this question of news and fake news and so forth. As a journalist, my industry, I know what goes on at responsible outlets. The New York Times is not fake news. The Washington Post is not fake news. The Wall Street Journal is not fake news, nor is the Associated Press or Reuters. The links organizations like that go to ensure that what they put out is accurate and fair and balanced on their news pages. Their editorial pages will say what they want. Is you can't imagine how a newsroom works in that area. The layers of editing, the conversations, and not only does it have to be accurate, it has to be fair and balanced. And one way you can see that, or two ways you can see that as a consumer, when after Donald Trump was elected, and he sort of created this fake news title, which I find so offensive, and most all of my legitimate journalism friends do. Those publications I mentioned started going to multiple sourcing on their stories. If you looked at it closely, you would notice that rather than just saying something like a U.S. official said, they would go to the lengths of saying 5 U.S. officials said this. They really cracked down on the use of anonymous sources, which is a plague in our system. And you're taught, and I teach it, to push as hard as you can to get people to be on the record, because people tend to say things that aren't necessarily that completely true when they're talking without their names associated with it. Particularly in the areas that I covered, national security and diplomacy, people didn't like to speak on the record, and sometimes what they had to say could lead to horrible consequences. So that's just my little tirade about news. And and if there's this proliferation of new content sites, Stalker, these both on the right and on the left, that are such, okay, it's the marketplace of ideas and all, and it's all protected by the Constitution, but they'll say and do things, we see it related to COVID and vaccinations, and and the election and so forth. And Steve Bannon, for example, I can't say enough bad things about Steve Bannon. I mean, who actually thinks they can defy a congressional subpoena and get away with it? I'm sorry to be, I said I wouldn't be political, but I am. And they have these blogs and these radio shows, and they don't check their sources. They don't check anything. They just put out what comes out of their mouth. And those are drivers of radicalization. I mean, I'm not saying radicalized people are bad people, because they're not. They're people who are fed up, and both state actors, and I won't name names, and non-state actors provide the fuel, or provide the fire, that is the match that is put to the tinder that people like Steve Bannon put under them.
Okay. Tom has kind of clarified a little bit and said that he meant really China and Russia. So how much did China and Russia contribute to radicalization in the US?
Well, I think it's certainly in their interest to have a weakened America, clearly. They don't, they are not democracies, so they don't operate in the same way that we do. There is so much that goes on under the radar on the web. Hacks and crypto hacks and ransomware and so forth. And it's no secret, it's all open source information, that China and Russia are behind these things. So I think I think they do everything. They'll walk right up to the edge of war. And I say that with the greatest gravity, because war with either of those nations would be the end of it. And I think everyone realizes it. I mean, it's kind of ironic you asked that, quite kind of coincidental, Tom. You asked that question today, which is the anniversary of President Kennedy announcing that Russia was building missile bases in Cuba. Just a few miles off the coast of Florida. Probably the closest, with the exception maybe of a certain moment in the Bosnian War, the closest we've ever come to war with Russia. I think it's in their interest to stoke those feelings. I think it's we all watched the kind of relationship that President Trump developed with Vladimir Putin, refusing to call him out on things, things anyone, even the staunchest Trump supporter would find offensive, which was Russia issuing bounties to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan. It's a proven point. So those are the kind of things they do, and of course they have propaganda outlets, and they can broadcast into the United States because they're protected by our Constitution. That said, the United States does a lot of those same things too. We have our broadcast services. Voice of America is a little different, but there's other broadcast services they have, and in a lot of these countries, radio is the primary form of news. And we, to a certain degree, do the same things, but I would say not anywhere near the level that Russia or China does.
Okay, Kayla Wagner wrote, I appreciate the connection that was made between radicalization and public health and safety. When looking at the violent radicalization, how often are people in this category cured? Is radicalization an incurable disease? How often do radical individuals move into some form of recovery?
Sure. So I'm sure there's so many examples, high-profile examples, and I'm sure you've seen them. The former gang leader that becomes an advocate for youth programs in the inner city. The white supremacist who joins some white supremacist group, but then realizes the error of his ways and becomes an advocate against it. There's a movie, and the name escapes me. Oh, American History X. Very hard movie to watch. Edward Norton, Stacy Keach, and it looks at that question in great detail. It's about a white supremacist group in California. And interestingly enough, we would, when I was working for that company, we would participate in lectures, in conferences, lots of conferences on these things, both overseas and in the United States. And I remember I was served on a panel at one in Los Angeles, which has a large, diverse population, and a big, surprisingly enough, white supremacist movement, also a big, Muslim extremist population. And I served on a panel with the son of a. It's funny, he just texted me a couple days ago out of the blue, just as I was preparing this, and we talked a little bit about it, had a little exchange about it. But he was well educated. He was the son of two psychiatrists. He was Canadian, and he fell prey, for a lot of the reasons I laid out, to a white supremacist movement. On that same panel was a Muslim woman, a Muslim American woman, who I have great respect for, who started an anti-radicalism group in the United States. Also does work overseas, and also a Native American. And our native. If you take a look, we did a little bit of work with indigenous people on these reservations because the chemistry is just ripe on these reservations for people being radicalized. And I have a hard time understanding why they're not more radicalized. I mean, if you've ever been on a native reservation, healthcare, employment, drug abuse, rape, it's terror. It's in a lot of cases, in a lot of places, it's really bad. So just that's a long way of getting to your question. Yes, communities can be healed. If you look at, there's a phenomenon in this country. I wasn't a huge supporter of Ronald Reagan, but he certainly did. There was that 20-year period after the Vietnam War with Watergate and Nixon and the 60s and topsy-turvy 70s and sort of, this stigma that surrounded America for almost 2 decades. And Ronald Reagan came in and, for a lot of different reasons, restored kind of our pride in a way. So the answer is yes, it can work, but it takes patience, and it's not inexpensive. It's expensive. Governments have to have commitments to it. And the people on the ground that are implementing these programs have to be committed to it. And, really, I would say most importantly is that you're able to prove that they're working in real ways, have metrics for success, diagnostics for success, because success breeds success. And in a lot of cases, it's generational. Now, the follow-on question might be, for those like me, to think that there's a very deep sickness in American society right now, and I'm not happy to say that, and I'm sorry if it offends anyone, but I think it's true. I don't know how quickly we heal, how quickly we recover from this deep-seated radicalization in this country. It seems to be progressing to me by looking at what's going on in Congress, people who are getting elected and why they're getting elected, the miasma of influence that our former president still has, the prospect that he might run again, the notion that, that calls into question, and if you look, at the 7 factors and the 8 dimensions, faith in the legitimacy of elections is critical, absolutely critical and fragile. And the idea that this last election was not legitimate, that somehow some company from Colombia or somewhere put in phony voting machines is, to me, it's science fiction, but people are believing it. And I don't know how or if we come back from that. And I don't know how you find programs to do that.
Okay, Sid, I think that pretty much brings us to our time. So thank you all for attending today, and thank you so much for your presentation, Sid. I think we all learned a lot. This was very interesting. Everyone who attended today gets a link to the recording of the lecture, and in just a couple days, hopefully, maybe even by the end of today, along with a 3-question survey that you can fill out to let us know what you thought of today and who you'd like to hear from in this series next. So keep an eye on us. We'll announce our next speaker soon, and we can anticipate a similar format for the next lecture. We're going to make it online so that our community near and far can attend with us. So we hope you have a great Friday and a great weekend, and we will see you at the next one. Thank you so much, Sid.
Just one thing, those of you who want to reach out to me, I have a website for my books. There's an email there, and I welcome your feedback, positive or negative.
Great. I'll include that information on the follow-up email then. All right. Thank you all. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Bye.